What's going on, guys? It's Zach here. Bring you guys another fantasy football video. This will be going over about 5 or 6 players that I think are pretty obvious sell highs for me, players that I would be looking to pretty much move on, regardless of whether or not I'm in a really good position or really bad position in terms of the playoffs. I want to get rid of these guys because I do think they're sort of peaked in terms of their fantasy value and to do what I can to get as much value out of them as possible. And after that, I'm going to touch on a couple players that either have really bad schedules for the next 3 weeks. So guys that I don't think are really going to be super helpful in terms of getting you into those fantasy playoffs. And I'll touch on some players as well that have really tough schedules for the fantasy playoffs, guys that I think that if you're in a position where you're starting to look towards that playoff schedule, get your lineups all set for those 3 weeks that really do matter if you've already locked up a playoff spot. I'll try and touch on some players that I think aren't necessarily going to be the best options for you there as well. So as always, if you guys do end up with any specific start sit questions, just let me know in the comments. I love helping you guys get all set with that. And then, of course, if you guys have any other additional questions, any players that you want to talk about as well, just let me know in the comments. It's a lot of fun just sort of going through that with you guys as well. And then, of course, today as well, the buy low video should have come out as well at this point. So if you're watching this one and you haven't seen that one, do go right watch that one as well. It should be really helpful and help you guys get as much context and get as many ideas floating around, help get you guys all those trades set before the before the trade deadlines, which obviously happen for a lot of people this week. A lot of people either have week 11 or week 12 trade deadlines in their fantasy leagues. So if this is yours, hopefully you get one more week to make things happen. We should get you all set for the playoffs. So it should be a lot of fun. Obviously, we've got a lot of games this week as well. We got 3 on Thanksgiving, 1 on Friday, and have a lot on Sunday, of course, as well. So it should be a fun week of football, and I'm super excited. So, yeah, with that, let's just get into the first player here. And then, of course, if you guys end up with any questions, just let me know. So we'll start things off. Like for me, one of my biggest sells right now is going to be Saquon Barkley. It was really fun while it lasted for Tommy DeVito and the Giants. They put up a really high quality performance against the Washington Commanders. Saquon Barkley caught 2 passing touchdowns at about 85 rushing yards, and it was really great to see Saquon be a really integral part of the offense and obviously perform at a high level the way you would hope he would as like someone that was drafted to be a running back 1 for your fantasy roster. And I do think that Saquon's got a shot to piece together another quality performance against the New England Patriots this week, but after that, it's just going to be really brutal. They got a bye in week 13, so he's not really going to help you next week, obviously. And then they do play Green Bay in week 14. That's a good matchup. He should be reliable for that week. But after that, they get New Orleans and Philadelphia in weeks 15 and 16. The Rams in week 17 is totally fine, but New Orleans and Philadelphia are 2 really brutal matchups, 2 good defenses, and they're not defenses that I think the Giants are really be able to move the ball on against it all. On top of that, there is, of course, a concern that Saquon Barkley's in a contract year. The Giants are 3-8 at this point. They're not in a position where it makes sense for them to be even really considering trying to make a push to win games. It helps the Giants more if they lose games going forward. So they could sort of do themselves a favor, do Saquon a favor, and shut him down for the last couple of games of the season. Let Saquon go into the offseason healthy so he can get a contract. Maybe they'll resign him, maybe they won't, but it also helps them get a better draft pick as well. So there's legitimate risk that Saquon Barkley misses games at the end of the season. And even if he doesn't, those 2 matchups against New Orleans and Philadelphia, I'm going to be worried about even starting him in my fantasy lineups. Nonetheless, even expecting him to be a running back 1 for me. So if you can get like running back 1 value for him, it makes so much sense for me. If you can get Austin Ekeler for him off of a bad performance, get Bijan Robinson off for him, convince the manager that, hey, Bijan's got a really tough schedule over the next 3 weeks. Saquon obviously just showed that he can perform in a Tommy DeVito offense. You can maybe get that trade done. Maybe you have to add a little bit, but those are trades that I would certainly consider doing because I think you're giving yourself more upside for the playoffs and just helping yourself avoid a potential nightmare situation with Saquon. So I do think I'd be looking to get rid of Saquon, but obviously don't just give him away for free. He's still an elite player, still someone that could easily be a high-end performer, but it's just the odds are sort of stacked against him at this point. Next, I do think that Zach Charbonnet is actually a pretty relatively easy still high for me. Obviously, any running back getting the volume we expect out of Zach Charbonnet is going to be usable for fantasy. He had 85% of the snaps this last week. That was with Kenneth Walker playing some of the game before leaving with an injury. So we should see a workhorse role for Zach Charbonnet. I know Kenny McIntosh is probably going to be activated. Probably will get some snaps for the Seahawks this week for the first time this year, but not going to be a guy that's going to threaten Zach Charbonnet for real work here. But the issue here is that the Seahawks obviously have arguably the most brutal schedule in the NFL going forward. And on top of that, Geno Smith is banged up. We'll see if Geno Smith can suit up in week 12 here, but they've got a matchup against the 49ers this week. Then they get the Cowboys, the Eagles, the Niners again, and then the Titans. So basically the next 5 matchups are really brutal for opposing running backs. Even the Titans, who have been beatable through the air, always have a really good run defense. So it's going to be a really tough situation here for Zach Charbonnet to be a high-end performer. Obviously, if you have Charbonnet, you're hoping that maybe we see Kenneth Walker get placed on IR. That could happen, but then you're just getting the next 4 weeks out of Zach Charbonnet where he's got those really brutal matchups. Not a guy that I think could legitimately be like a running back 1 for people. And I know there are a lot of people that think Zach Charbonnet is an elite player. I do think he's a talented player. He was a 2nd-round draft pick in the NFL for a reason, but I don't think that you can actually count on Zach Charbonnet as like a weekly reliable starter with just how brutal these matchups are going to be. Obviously, the volume is going to make him someone you can put in like starting consideration anytime, but these matchups are super brutal. The Seahawks offense can certainly implode going forward, and it's not something that I'm super excited about. And I think if you could trade Charbonnet for like a reliable weekly asset, it makes a lot of sense to do that. One of my most competitive leagues, I've been sort of holding Charbonnet on my bench, and now that this injury has happened, I sent an offer of Charbonnet for Pacheco to the Walker manager in that league. A trade that sort of makes sense for both sides, I think, but I would certainly prefer Isaiah Pacheco going forward. Similar trades to that, I think, just make a lot of sense. Get yourself like a solid running back two for Charbonnet, and then just sort of live with whatever happens, because I don't think Charbonnet is going to be someone that you can count on a week in and week out basis going forward. Next, I'm going to talk about DJ Moore. Obviously, DJ Moore's made this list for me many times so far this season. And after another game that he really didn't do much outside of a single long 40-yard touchdown, I think it just makes a lot of sense to put him back on this list. He's got a plus matchup in week 12 against the Minnesota Vikings on Monday Night Football. That should be a fun game. But after that, he's got a week 13 matchup, and then he faces the Cleveland Browns in week 1 of the fantasy playoffs. I don't see a world where I trust DJ Moore or really anybody in this Bears offense against the Cleveland Browns defense in the first week of the fantasy playoffs. And he is also not going to be super helpful over the next 3 weeks because he's obviously got that bye put in there. Whether you're a team that needs to make the playoffs, obviously it makes a lot of sense to trade him and avoid that bye, or maybe you're a team that's already in the playoffs. It doesn't make sense to roster a guy that you're not going to be able to use in the first week of them. So I just don't trust him as someone that I want to be relying on a week in, week out basis. And I think you can get like legitimate wide receiver 2 value for him. Just say, hey, look, Justin Fields came back, and right immediately DJ Moore was lead again. So I think you can get legitimate wide receiver 2 value for him, maybe even top 15 wide receiver value. And I don't think he's actually worth that or even near that. So if you can get that kind of value for him, it just makes a lot of sense for me to move off of DJ Moore. Brian Robinson, another player that's been really fun to ride. I've got him in several leagues this season. It's been really fun to have him, but I think it's time to take value on a player that's performing as the RB4 on the season. And it's just time to take that value here. He's got a brutal matchup against Dallas this week. He's got a bye in week 14. And then his playoff schedule is just brutal. He gets the Rams in week 15. That's not awful. But then the Jets and the 49ers. Just no matchup here that's going to be super exciting. On top of that, Antonio Gibson should be back this week. Part of the big reason why Brian Robinson was so great this last week is because he set a career high in targets, because he was really the only healthy running back in Washington. There will be more competition for touches in that offense. Brian Robinson's going to have less touchdown opportunity. And I really do think that in general, Brian Robinson is a touchdown dependent running back too. If you can sell him and get running back 1 value for him, it just makes way too much sense. I would definitely be looking to do that right now. Then last, but certainly not least, I do want to talk about Calvin Ridley. I don't truly know what the market is for Ridley right now, so it was tough for me to decide whether or not I wanted to put him on this list, but I just wanted to talk about him some. I sort of view him personally as like a low-end wide receiver 2 with a lot of volatility built in. There's going to be some weeks where he puts up 5 points, and some weeks like this last week where he puts up 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. And I think that's generally your range of outcomes here. You're dealing with like a rich man's Gabe Davis, sort of. Maybe that's a little bit too harsh, but I think Calvin Ridley's obviously a really talented player. He should be in what should be like a really good offense, but he's coming off of a top tier performance. I think it just makes a lot of sense to sell high on him. I think you can use the narrative that, hey, look at how well he's performed in the 4 games with Zay Jones versus without him. Say Zay Jones is back. That makes Calvin Ridley the focal point of the offense. I think that's just been more of like a matchup dependent issue, not necessarily anything to do with Zay Jones actually being there. On top of that, in weeks 14 and 15, you get Cleveland and Baltimore. Those are 2 straight matchups. So I don't think I'm going to even feel confident in starting Calvin Ridley. So I think you're in a situation there where Calvin Ridley is just not going to be a super reliable asset for you. And if you can get wide receiver 2 value, like high end wide receiver 2 value, say, hey, look, he's back. Trevor Lawrence is playing awesome now, finally had a 4 touchdown game. If you can say, hey, this offense is turning the corner and Ridley's going to be a wide receiver 1, then I think you can sell high on that narrative. But I wouldn't just give him away either. I do think he's like a low end wide receiver 2. Could have some weak winning performances the rest of the way, but it's not a guy that I think is going to be super consistent going forward. And then last, I just want to talk about some players with brutal playoff schedules and then also really brutal schedules over the next 3 weeks. So these will be guys that just things to keep in mind as always. And obviously, these aren't all the players in the NFL with either really bad schedules the next 3 weeks or in the playoffs, but it's some of the most notable ones that I did want to bring up. They'll start things off with Rachaad White. He's got a really brutal playoff schedule. He's got Green Bay in week 15, which is great, but then Jacksonville and New Orleans have been 2 really great run defenses so far this season. Obviously, Rachaad White's involved as a pass catcher that I'm not super concerned with it, but I did just want to bring it up. Something that I would be a little bit concerned about going forward. Alvin Kamara as well, super brutal, at least weeks 15 or 16 and 17. He's got a great week 15 matchup against the Giants, but against the Rams and the Buccaneers, not fantastic at all for opposing running backs. We've also seen his snaps dip a little bit. The Saints are sort of looking to save him for the playoffs. I think we could continue seeing that happen. And on top of that, if we do end up seeing either maybe it's concussion lingers for Derek Carr, we got to report that he's still in concussion protocol. We don't know about that shoulder injury either. If we see a situation where Jameis Winston is under center for the Saints. Obviously, Alvin Kamara would take a huge hit. So that's something to consider for sure. Amari Cooper, he's someone that probably should have made the sell high list. He's got matchups with Chicago, Houston, and the Jets. Neither one of those is necessarily a plus matchup for Amari Cooper. And on top of that, Amari Cooper is a guy who's going to be dealing with DTR throwing the ball to him. He's not a guy that I'm going to feel confident in starting in the fantasy playoffs at all. So if you have him and want to move off him, I think it makes a lot of sense. I would take just about anything to get him. If you can get wide receiver 2, maybe even wide receiver 3 value, I'd probably do that. Once again, I want to bring up the Miami wide receivers. They play the Jets, Cowboys, and Ravens. That is absolutely brutal. The Dolphins have yet to show to us they can actually perform at a high level against a good defense. They even struggled a little bit against the Las Vegas Raiders this last week. I don't know how legit this Miami Dolphins offense is. And outside of Tyreek Hill, I think they could struggle throwing the ball. And obviously, this is worse for Jalen Waddle than Tyreek Hill for me, but just a really brutal situation for them. I think it's tough to really necessarily move off of them. Obviously, Jalen Waddle, it's tough to sell right now because he hasn't done a whole lot. And then Tyreek Hill, it really doesn't feel like you should ever be selling him. So I don't know how actionable this is, but I just don't think you'll see any like stealing games out of either one of those guys in the fantasy playoffs. Terry McLaurin, I want to mention, they get the Rams in week 15, so that's not bad. Then you get the Jets and the 49ers the following 2 weeks. Really tough matchups for Terry McLaurin and honestly all the pass catchers in Washington. Could be really tough. I still think McLaurin's like a low-end wide receiver 2, maybe like a wide receiver 3 going forward, but I just wouldn't expect any sort of ceiling performances out of him in the playoffs. And then a really notable one I want to bring up is going to be Dalton Schultz. He's been obviously a staple in a lot of people's lineups at the tight end position. He plays Tennessee and Cleveland. He plays Tennessee twice in weeks 15 and 17. 2 of the best defenses against opposing tight ends. Could be just a really rough situation there for Dalton Schultz. I think Tennessee could be a little bit just fluky. They're obviously not a great pass defense, and Dalton Schultz is involved enough in the offense that I'm not necessarily scared of it. But here's something to point out. If you have Dalton Schultz and consider flipping him for like an equal asset at the tight end position, I think it makes some level of sense to do that. And then last, I just want to talk about some players with a really brutal schedule over the next 3 weeks. These are guys that I just don't think are going to be really useful in terms of helping get you into the fantasy playoffs. So I'll start things off with Patrick Mahomes. He plays Las Vegas, Green Bay, and Buffalo. Against Vegas and Green Bay, they're 2 teams that really just can't score very well, especially with the Chiefs defense, and they can get run on. So I think you could see a situation out of Kansas City where maybe they just run the ball really well and don't throw the ball too much over the next 3 weeks. And that could mean really bad things for Patrick Mahomes. That Buffalo game obviously has got a shot to be a shootout, so that one's relatively exciting. But I think Patrick Mahomes is honestly just due for a bit of regression here, probably not going to be like a high-end performer, at least for the next 2 weeks, and hopefully hits the ground running when he plays Buffalo and takes you into the playoffs. But I just wouldn't expect him to carry you into the playoffs on his own. Bijan Robinson plays New Orleans, the Jets, and the Buccaneers over the next 3 weeks. I've talked about how he's got a really great playoff schedule, but this schedule over the next 3 weeks is absolutely awful. Not going to be a situation where I would expect a lot of high-end performances out of him. He's still going to have a lot of volume, still a good player, so he'll be fine, but he's not going to be elite over the next 3 weeks. And then he should be able to turn that quarter once the playoffs start. But just keep that in mind with Bijan. James Cook, I don't even think he's usable over the next 3 weeks. He gets Philadelphia, has a bye, then plays Kansas City. That's a really tough matchup in week 15 as well. So for the next month, I don't think James Cook's all that useful. He could have easily made the sell high video. He's someone that I'd probably be looking to move off of if I can. The Rams wide receivers, they play Arizona this week. That's not all that bad, but then they get Cleveland and Baltimore over the next 2 weeks. Obviously, Cooper Kupp is banged up as well a little bit. If you have him and you need to win the next 3 weeks, I consider moving him. Puka Nacua is also a guy that I could consider moving if I need to win out to make the playoffs. And last, I felt like I needed to bring up a tight end here. So the best I could find was Trey McBride. I don't know how prescriptive this is here, but they do play the Rams, who have been a really good defense against tight ends, along with Pittsburgh, a really tough tight end defense. And then they have a bye in week 14. So Trey McBride could be a little bit useless, just not like a peak performer over the next 3 weeks, but he played 100% of the snaps for the Cardinals. He's a good player. I can't imagine moving off of him if he's your tight end. So I think it's fine, but just understand that he's probably not going to be an elite performer over the next 3 weeks. So that'll do it for the Sell High video. Up next, I'll talk, so instead of the Thursday Night Football primer, I'll do a Thanksgiving and a Black Friday preview. So we'll have 4 games to preview there, and then we'll get the Saturday morning video where I'll talk over the starts and sits of every other game. And Sunday morning, you guys should get the live stream as well, where I'll go over any last-minute injury updates. So as always, if you guys have any specific start-sit questions, any sort of specific trade questions, just let me know in the comments. I love helping you guys get your lineup set, get your roster set, and hopefully get you guys all set to help win those matchups this week, win the next 3 weeks, and get yourself into the playoffs and get yourself some championships. So if you guys want to make sure you don't miss any videos going forward, just make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We're at 955 subscribers right now, so just 45 away from that goal of 1,000 by the end of the season. Really think we can get there. Just check and make sure if you've subscribed. If you haven't, just click that subscribe button. Be happy to have you as a part of the community, and it should be a lot of fun to keep growing with you guys. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. Of course, as always, if you guys have any questions, just let me know. And yeah, really appreciate it, everything you guys do and taking the time to watch these videos. It's been super cool. And hopefully we have a really good next month and a half to get you guys some championships. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.